Le sommet international de l'éducation du futur réunit une soixantaine de conférenciers du monde entier. Des pionniers et des innovateurs issus du monde de l'éducation, bien évidemment, mais également des êtres inspirants, issus des chemins de sagesse ou des chemins d'apprentissage et de créativité dans différents domaines. Les arts, les sciences, l'économie, le lien avec la nature, le sport, etc. Des expériences et des chemins de vie qui sont un formidable enrichissement pour le monde de l'éducation. Le professionnalisme des traductions, en simultané, et l'incroyable richesse de toutes ces conférences offrent un horizon de point de vue vaste et varié, très complet, qui en font au final une véritable formation professionnelle pour les enseignants, les éducateurs et tous les professionnels de l'éducation, mais également une formation à la parentalité consciente et une formation individuelle à la vie consciente. Face à toute cette richesse et aux divers retours, nous avons décidé d'offrir toutes ces conférences à tous, partout dans le monde, en français et en anglais, quelquefois en allemand et en espagnol. Découvrez la vision d'acteurs audacieux et influents du changement, vers un monde éthique, solidaire, généreux et profondément respectueux de tous, des cultures, des peuples, des règnes et de la planète. Un incroyable panel de conférences, couvrant toutes les dimensions de l'éducation, pour un futur ayant du sens, une humanité épanouie et une terre qui respire. Une chose est sûre, votre vie, et à travers vous, celle des enfants, ne sera plus la même après avoir écouté toutes ces conférences. Pour avancer, nous avons besoin de vous, nous avons besoin de votre générosité solidaire. L'organisation du sommet et l'édition des conférences ont nécessité des milliers d'heures de travail et nécessitent encore beaucoup de temps et d'investissement. Nous faisons appel aux dons libres et spontanés pour compléter le financement du sommet et, si possible, continuer à l'enrichir de nouvelles conférences. Votre soutien est vraiment précieux et vital pour aller jusqu'au bout de cette aventure extraordinaire. Merci.
So hello, everybody. Welcome. I am honored to introduce Peter Gray from America, who is a person who really encourages that we don't focus so much on school, but that we let the children play again and encourage play in all ways and free play. So Peter is a researcher, professor of psychology and neuroscience at Boston College. His recent research focused on the role of play in the human evolution. He is an author on a regular blog called Freedom to Learn, and he wrote the book Free to Learn, Why Unleashing the Instinct of Play Will Make Our Children Happier, More Self-Reliant, and Better Students for Life. He shares about the importance of free, self-directed play and exploration, independent from adult control. Without it, research on animals deprived from play showed that they become fearful about their environment and each other, and children, it's even more so. And we have so many things happening in our society because children are deprived of play. Goes to fear, depression, suicide, all things that Peter talks about, a decline in empathy and creativity. And I really like a part where Peter speaks about anthropologists that studied in indigenous cultures and say that the children could play all day long when they were young and into their early teens. And it was normal for parents. Of course, we're going to let them play. That's how they become adults. And that the anthropologists, in observing these children, realized they were the brightest, happiest, most resilient, cooperative, and well-adjusted children they had observed. So Children Playing Today is the Key to a Happy and Peaceful World Tomorrow is the title of Peter's conference, and I will give him the turn to speak.
Thank you. So I'm just going to change this view here. So I put in the chat the link to a handout to this talk. So if you can do it, if you can just click on that, you'll find a Google Doc that lists the main ideas of the talk and some references at the end. And I'll refer to this from time to time as I go. So if it's possible for you to download that, I would appreciate it if you do that. If you happen to have a printer handy, you could print it out, or you could put it on a different screen, or just keep it in the background of this screen and go to it when you want to refer to it. So again, that's the handout that I just put in the chat. It's right there at the bottom of the chat. So this is...
Would you like me to put it in the chat, a part of it, a copy of it?
Oh, you could do that. Yeah, that's not a bad idea. You could put it in and kind of as I go along, if you want, put in the parts of it.
Yeah.
That's a great idea. Thank you for thinking of that.
You're welcome.
That'll make it easier. People can have it right in front of them then. Okay. Terrific. So, this is of course a symposium on education for the future, and I'm making the claim that if we want a good future, if we want people to be happy, if we want a peaceful world, the best way to do that is to allow children and also adults, but especially children, lots of opportunity to play. So I've entitled this talk, Children's Playing Today is Key to a Happy and Peaceful World Tomorrow. So I have to start by saying what I mean by by education. Education for the future. What is education? You know, we often talk about education without actually making it really clear what we mean by education. And most people, I think, throughout the world, the word education refers to school, how much school you've had. But that's a kind of unsatisfying definition of education. You could do a lot of school and not be very educated by, common sense judgment of what education should be. Or you could do no school or very little school and be very educated. I mean, here in America, Benjamin Franklin is regarded as one of the most educated people in the world, but huge contributions in all sorts of fields. He had 2 years of school. So school isn't the definition of education. It's not a very meaningful definition of education. So my definition of education is a very short one. It is that education is whatever a person learns that enables that person to live a satisfying, meaningful, and moral life. This is what we want for people. This is what we want for our own children. This is what we want for all the children, all the people of the future. Live a happy, meaningful, satisfying, and moral life. The moral part meaning that you're doing more good for the world than harm. You're helping people more than hurting them. This is education. Education isn't synonymous with learning. We can learn all kinds of things that are not useful to us. We can learn things that don't help us live. We can learn bad habits. We can learn misinformation. We can learn how to hurt other people. There's all kinds of things we can learn that I don't call education. Education is the good part of learning. Education is the part of learning that leads to a better future, both for individual people and for the society at large. So given that definition of education, how do people become educated? I have argued in my book and in much of my writing that children come into the world biologically designed to educate themselves. It's not difficult to understand what that biological design entails. If this were a different talk, I would go into great detail about that. But the two primary characteristics of that biological design are the drives of curiosity and playfulness. Children come into the world incredibly curious. They are immediately, even as soon as their eyes can fix, they're already exploring the world visually around them. They're looking at new things more than at old things. As soon as they can move, why are they moving? They're moving to get to things so they can explore them. They can see what it feels like in their mouth. They can, as they get a little bit older, as they can manipulate it. What happens if I drop this thing? What can I do with this thing? Children are constantly, that's why we have to baby-proof our houses, because they're constantly getting into things, not to be naughty, but because they want to figure out what this is. What can I do with this? What is the nature of this thing? And they're exploring, so they're exploring the physical world around them, they're exploring the social world around them because they are curious. And this curiosity does not decline with age unless we kill it. And our schools tend to kill it, because once you're in school, your questions no longer count. It's now the questions of the school, which may not even be the questions of the real questions for the teacher. They're just questions of the curriculum. You're not interested in that, or not interested in very much of it, or most people aren't interested in very much of it. So you realize that your questions don't count, that your curiosity doesn't matter. And so your curiosity gets squelched. You're no longer as motivated by curiosity as you were before. You now realize that what your job is in school is to sort of memorize, or in some ways incorporate, so that you can pass tests, the things that are on the curriculum rather than the things that you actually think are important for your life. So that's curiosity. And then the other curiosity then is the natural ways that children acquire information and knowledge. So there's two aspects to education. One is the acquisition of information and knowledge, and the other is the acquisition of skills. So the complement to curiosity, the other part of the human nature of learning, is playfulness. Play is how children acquire skills. In fact, play is how pretty much all young mammals acquire skills. The purpose of play, the original evolutionary purpose of play, although it has other purposes as well, is to practice skills. So all animals play at the kinds of skills that they need to acquire. At least all mammals that have been studied do. Need to play at the kinds of skills they need to acquire. So predatory animals play at predation. Prey animals play at dodging and darting and getting away from predatory animals, and so on and so forth. Monkeys play at swinging around in trees. Goats play at leaping over cliffs, and so on and so forth. Whatever the constraints are to the survival and reproduction of a particular species of animal, those are the things that animal plays at. No surprise then that when they are free, our children play more than the young of any other species of animal. We have more to learn, more different kinds of things to learn. And so our children come into the world with a stronger drive to play than the young of any other animals do, and with drives to play in a variety of ways, because there are such a different variety of things that we human beings have to learn in order to be successful in the culture that we are growing up in, and in some sense to be successful in any human culture. So I now want to talk about what really is play. Before I begin, I should say that play is, so if you're following the syllabus, we are now on Roman numeral 2 on the syllabus, the paradoxes of play. So the more you think about play, the more you realize that there are certain contradictions in the very concept of play, seeming contradictions. I'm going to argue they're not really contradictions, but they seem like contradictions. play is serious. You know, watch any young kids playing, and they're often very serious. They're not necessarily smiling or laughing. They're not acting silly. They're very serious. They're very much into what they are doing. They've got a serious expression. This is serious activity to them. But at the same time, even those children who look serious while they're playing know that in some sense this is not serious. This is not real life. This is play. This is something different from real life. I'm seriously involved in this thing, but it's not, it's in some sense not serious. I'm free to fail because it doesn't really count. Nobody's evaluating me here. This is not real life. This is a safe place for me to do this thing because it is just play. So that's the first paradox. It's serious and yet it's not serious. A second paradox is that play is imaginative and spontaneous. Yes, children freely choose to play. But at the same time, all play is not free. Once you're playing, it's not free. It's not, you're not doing, you are now constrained by rules. All play has rules. Of course, formal games, the rules are maybe written down or they're verbally transmitted in one way or another, but all play has boundaries to it, has rules. When the child chooses to play, the child freely chooses to play, but in doing so, the child is limiting his or her own freedom. You now have to follow whatever the rules are of play. I'm going to, of this kind of play, whatever it is you're doing. I'm going to elaborate on that more as I go along. So play is, the next paradox is that play is not real. It takes place in a fantasy world, as I just said. And yet play is always about the real world. Play is how children learn to cope with the real world. It's how they practice the skills important to the real world. It's how they incorporate some of the knowledge that they've acquired about the real world. And a final paradox is that play is childish. It is properly thought of as childish because children play much more than adults do, quite appropriately so, because children have much more to learn than adults do. The young of all mammals, essentially all mammals, play much more than the adults of those mammals. In many species of mammals, adults don't play at all. It's just the kids. It's just the juveniles that play. So play is childish, and yet playfulness and play itself to some extent underlies the greatest achievements of adults. If you look at the biographies and autobiographies of those people who have contributed the most to our culture through their inventions, through their writings, through their diplomatic competence and so forth, they played. They played as adults. They will say, Einstein, for example, often said that, you know, whatever accomplishments I made in theoretical physics and in mathematics, this was all mental play. This was play of the mind. This was, he often said that he persisted in these abilities not because of his schooling, but despite it, that the schooling almost killed it. For some period of time after studying mathematics in school, he said, I couldn't even think about mathematics for a while. So play underlies, this is just one example, but play underlies the achievements of adults as at the same time that it provides the foundation for learning and the development of creativity in children. So, so these are some paradoxes of play. On B on this handout, under Roman numeral 2, I list some universal varieties of play. Anthropologists who have studied play throughout the world, and particularly in cultures where children still have lots of time to play. It would be hard to observe some of this in many of our Western cultures today and many of other modern cultures today, because we restrict children's play. But when you look at children who are free to play as much as they want to play, They play in all of the ways that I've listed here under universal varieties of play. Pretty much all children play in all of these ways, and that's how they develop the broad set of human skills that are important for human development. So they play in physical, locomotor ways. This is the kind of play that we most obviously share with other mammals. We have physical bodies like other mammals do. We have to develop those bodies. How do we develop those bodies if we are children living in a natural? We develop them by playing in vigorous ways. We rough and tumble. We climb trees. We chase one another around. We play even in somewhat dangerous ways. We climb trees higher than maybe our moms would want us to climb. We leap over cliffs. We dive off of cliffs into bodies of water. We engage in all kinds of vigorous and, in some sense, moderately risky forms of play. And this is how we develop strong bodies. This is how we develop good motor coordination. This is also how we develop courage. When we play in risky ways, we are learning that I can climb this tree up high enough to feel a certain amount of fear, and I can handle that fear. I can handle it. If I feel terror, if I feel too much, then I can just come down. That's the great thing about play. You can quit. You can quit when it's too much for you. But this is how children acquire courage. This is the fact that, you know, a child who has had experience climbing trees and doing other kinds of risky things, testing her amount of fear that she can feel, that child is much less likely to have a panic attack later on in life when fear does occur in a real emergency. That child is much more likely as an adult to be able to save herself or her child or somebody else, because she's not going to freeze up with fear because she has practice dealing with fear. So that's the kind, and it turns out that other young mammals also play in risky ways. And animal behaviorists came up with this theory before any psychologist did, that the reason they play in risky ways is in order to develop courage, in order to learn how to deal with fear and not lose control of your mind and your body because you are feeling a sense of fear. So the next ways of playing that I've listed here, or functional purposes of play that I've listed here, all are uniquely human, or almost uniquely human. You don't see these, or you see these very little, arguably not at all, in other species of mammals. So we are the animal that's capable of language, that has language. In order to function well in our society, we pretty much need to acquire our native language. Nobody teaches children their native language. Children learn their native language by paying attention to it around them. They hear it. They practice it in their play. The first cooing and babbling, if you've watched an infant, is always when the child is in a playful mood, and it's done playfully. The first words that children use are never used instrumentally. They're never used to ask for something. What research has shown is that the first words are always used playfully, just pointing things out, just having fun with the language. And as children get older, they begin to sort of play with the constructions of language, riddles and rhymes and alliterations and so on. And there are doctoral dissertations on what's called crib speech, where they will record young children talking to themselves. And it's almost like they're giving themselves little lessons. They're saying the same thing over and over again, but in somewhat different ways, trying out different ways of saying things, trying out the construction of language. So that's purely linguistic play. As children get older, they of course have to use language in all of their social play. You need to use language to communicate with one another. Social play always requires communication. You have to coordinate your activities with one another. And among human beings, the way you coordinate activities is with play. There's actually research showing that young children use much more sophisticated language when they're playing with other children than they do when they're talking with adults or when they are answering a teacher in the classroom. Not surprisingly, shouldn't be surprising that this is true, because when they're playing, the communication is really important. It's important to them. They have to express their needs. They have to tell their playmates, no, you can't do it this way. You have to do it this way, and so on and so forth. They're constantly negotiating with one another in play, explaining the rules to one another, explaining what part they want to have, and so on. So language is developed largely in play. It's not developed by and it's not developed largely by talking with adults. It's not developed largely by by language classes in school. There's actually a lot of research showing this, and a lot of it is old research where, for example, it used to be in the United States that when families from another country that did not speak English moved into a neighborhood in the United States, the children very quickly learned English, even though the parents didn't. And the children learned English because they were playing in the neighborhood with other kids who spoke English, and so they very quickly picked up English. Much quicker than they would pick it up by taking English as a foreign language in school. But now, this is not happening so much because children don't have the same opportunities to just go outdoors and play with other kids who are English speaking as they did in the past. Another thing, characteristic of human beings that distinguishes us from most other species of animals is that we are the animal that builds things. We build our environment. We build shelters. We build means of conveyance. We build tools. This has been part of human nature as long as we have been human beings. And so it's not surprising that children come into the world designed to practice building things. And that is what we call constructive play, play in which they're building things. They may be building model boats. They may be building little bows and arrows. They may be building sandcastles. They may be building towers of blocks, and so on and so forth. What they build depends to a considerable degree on what culture they're growing up in. They tend to build things that are similar to the kinds of things that adults might be building in the culture that they live in. But whatever they're building, they're learning how to use these opposable thumbs. They're learning how to manually manipulate things. They're learning how they're developing those parts of the brain that are involved in planning out what you're going to build and then proceeding to build it. So constructive play is a uniquely human form of play. We are also, as far as we know, the only animal that's really capable of imagination. We are capable of thinking about things that have never existed, or at least not existed in our lives. We're capable of thinking of things that aren't there. That's imagination. That's what allows us to be inventors. That's what allows us to make plans for tomorrow. Tomorrow hasn't happened yet, but we can think about tomorrow. We can think about things that aren't there. That's all imagination. Imagination is the foundation for what we think of as the highest form of human reasoning, which is hypothetical reasoning, hypothetical deductive reasoning. What if this were true? If this were true, then what else has to be true? Well, children are constantly involved in imagination in play. And in fact, I'm going to argue that essentially all play involves at least an element of imagination. You're stepping into an imaginary world in which you are supposing certain things are true, even if they're not true in the real world. And if those things are true, then what else has to be true? So little kids, think of little kids playing a fantasy game, 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds. They're imagining that the kitchen table is a bridge, and there's a troll under the bridge. And if there's a troll under the bridge, we better not go under the bridge, or we better find something to feed the troll so he doesn't eat us. This is hypothetical reasoning. The developmental psychologist Piaget, who's so famous, used to argue that children are incapable of hypothetical reasoning until they're 11 or 12 years old. He was wrong. Children are clearly capable of hypothetical reasoning, and they do it all the time in play as early as 3 and 4 years old. They're capable of hypothetical reasoning. But for the large part, early on, they only do it in play because the play world is a hypothetical world. They're entering this hypothetical world and they're practicing. And then later on, they begin to apply this hypothetical world to more real world thinking when they're making plans for the real world. So, play is that's imaginary fantasy play. We call it socio-dramatic play when it involves a number of children and they're creating scenes and acting them out. And then finally, we are the species of animal that has to follow rules. We can't just behave according to our instincts and whims. In fact, if somebody behaves that way, we tend to call them an animal. This person's acting like an animal rather than like a human being. They're not abiding by the conventions and norms of our society, and in ways that are disturbing other people and are obnoxious and so on and so forth. We have to abide by certain kinds of rules in order to get along in human society. And so it turns out that all play involves rules. I'm going to argue that. Some play, the kind of play that we call formal games, the rules are very formal. They're like laws in our culture. This is, if you're going to play this game, you really have to follow these rules. You can't step out of them. So that's the other thing that think of these. These are in some sense the essential things that human beings have to learn in order to live a satisfying and meaningful life, and also, I would argue, a moral life. And they're all practiced in play. They're practiced in play more readily than in any other way. None of these things can really be taught. You have to practice it, and play is the means of practice. So the final thing on this list is perhaps what's most important of all: social play. All social animals, including us, play socially, including our young children want to play in all the ways that I've just described, but no matter how they're playing, they want most of all to be playing with other children, whether they're playing in a vigorous locomotor way, whether they're playing linguistically, whether they're building things, whether they are playing an imaginary game, whether they're playing a formal game with rules. They want most of all to play with other children. Sometimes you want to play by yourself, maybe in some kind of artistic play, and you want to do it just your way, and you don't want to negotiate and compromise, and so on. There are some times when you want to play socially, but most children throughout the world, most of the time, want to play with other children. Why? Because the most important thing that humans have to learn for a satisfying and meaningful and moral life is how to get along with other people. If you can't get along with other people, you can't live a meaningful, satisfying life. We are social animals. We are absolutely dependent on being able to get along well with other people. If you can't do this, you can't have a good marriage, you can't have good work partners, you can't have real friends, you can't have a happy life without being able to connect well with other people. So no surprise, the drive to play is intimately linked to the drive to socialize. Children want to play with other children, and they want to play with other children away from adults. Let me repeat that: away from adults. And the reason they want to play away from adults is because adults intervene. Adults tell them what to do. Adults solve their problems for them. They want to learn. They may not articulate this. They may not even be aware that this is what they want to learn. But in their DNA, in their gut, in their bones, they want to learn how to get along with other people without some higher authority figure resolving the conflicts between them. They want to learn how to deal with minor bullying. They want to learn how to deal with disagreements among themselves. They want to learn how to compromise. They want to learn how to coordinate their activities with other children. And in some sense, they know that the way that they do this is through playing with other children away from adults. So those are the ways that children are biologically designed to play, and those are the ways that children learn the kinds of skills that are required for a satisfying and meaningful and moral life. Now, I still haven't really defined play, so we are now on C on the handout, defining characteristics of play. So I have, a lot of people say that, well, it's really hard to study play because nobody can really define play. The play doesn't have any clear definition. So I take issue with that. I think play can be defined. And because of that, I have defined it in various places, and people can find them. If you just Google definition of play, you'll come to a definition that I wrote that is much found and Googled. And so so here is, I shouldn't say that I'm the first to define play. I don't want to say that at all. And in fact, my definition of play is based on some classic definitions that other researchers have developed, often many years ago. And I've brought together what I see to be the main aspects of those definitions, the most, those that seem to characteristic play the best and are most often part of other people's definitions. So my definition is that play is an activity that has 5 characteristics. To the degree that all of these 5 characteristics are fully present, it's fully play. To the degree that only some of these characteristics are present, or they're not fully present but partially present, we could call it a playful activity, but not fully play. Full play is primarily found in children. Playful activity is very often found in adults. We don't often find full play in adults, but full play is very common among children. So the first characteristic that I've listed for play is that it is self-chosen and self-directed. So right off, what that means is that play is something that children themselves take the initiative to do and choose to do. And it is something that they control themselves. They decide on the rules. They modify the rules if the rules are going to be modified. They determine what they're doing and how it changes as it progresses. So right off, play is, in addition to all the things I've just talked about that children learn in play, play is how children learn how to take initiative, how they learn to choose their own activities, and how they learn to direct those activities. Extremely important. This is how you learn to take control of your life. In play, you learn how to choose an activity that you want to do, how to get it started, how to keep it going. Now, I've said here that play is self-chosen and self-directed, but I've also said that play is social. Most children, most of the time, want to play with other children. And in most parts of the world where there's a lot of kids around and they're capable of playing with other kids away from adults, most play is with other children. So I say it's self-directed, but I've also said that it's social. So what this means is that a group of kids deciding to play together have to communicate with one another. They have to decide together what they're going to play. I want to play this, you want to play that. Well, let's think of something that we might both want to play. We begin to play, and maybe I'm a little bit of a bully, and I want you to play in just the way that I want you to play, and it may not be the way you want to play, and so you protest that, and then we have an argument or a discussion, come to a compromise, figure out how we can both play. So the point I'm making here is that because play is self-initiated and self-directed, but most often social, play is how children learn to negotiate, how to compromise, how to pay attention to one another's needs and satisfy those needs. I want, if I'm a child and you're a child, I want very much to play with you. But you're not going to play with me unless I pay attention to your needs. And so in play, I have to learn how to do that. And if I don't learn how to do that, you, if you are a self-respecting child, will say, look, I'm out of here. I'm not going to play this way. This is not making me happy. I'm not going to do just what you want me to do. And this is an important lesson for me if I'm a child. I'm learning, whoa, I want to play with this person. But she just left me, or he just left me because apparently this person didn't want to play. So next time, maybe I'll be a little more attentive to this other person's needs, and I'll learn how to pay attention. I'll learn how to pay attention to their needs. I'll learn eventually. I have to pay attention not only to what the person tells me, but even to their facial expressions. Is this person having fun or not having fun? If the person is not having fun, I better modify my behavior so this person is having fun, because otherwise this person is likely to leave me. I may not, as a young child, articulate it that way, but I do understand it. Now think about that. What an important skill that is, to be able to pay attention to your playmates' nonverbal as well as verbal indications of whether they're having fun or not. This is an essential human skill. If you can't do this, you can't have a good marriage. You can't have real you can't have good work partners. You can't have real friends if you cannot do this. This may be the most important thing that human beings need to learn to live a meaningful, satisfying, and moral life. So that's the first characteristic of play. Let me illustrate also this point by describing the difference between an old-fashioned informal game of baseball. I'll choose baseball just because that's what I played a lot of as a kid in the 1950s. And a more modern Little League game of baseball for children, which is a formal game, adult directed. So when I was a kid, in the towns at least in one of the towns that I lived in, baseball was a huge activity for young kids, from the age of about 7 or 8 on through about 12 or 13. And we would play baseball by going out to the vacant lot, and there'd be a bunch of other kids going out to the vacant lot. There'd be no adults there. There never was adults there. And we would get up a game. We'd choose sides. We'd create the bases. We'd create ground rules depending on what vacant lot we were at. If there was a busy street, we'd say, hit it out into that street, it's an automatic out. There'd be big kids who could really slam the ball. There'd be little kids who are new to baseball. There would be some girls as well as boys who had maybe different approaches to how they would want to play. And the way that we would have to play is somehow, because to play, we've got to make everybody happy. We have to figure out ways of playing that's going to make everybody happy. That's the fundamental requirement for play. And so we choose up teams as best we can to make them relatively even. We lay out the bases. We create ground rules. There's an implicit assumption that you're going to pitch very softly to the little kids or the people who are novices. You're going to pitch hard to the people who could slam it. You're going to maybe give some handicaps to the better players, like, the kid who could really hammer the ball and would knock it out into the street and cause a problem by doing that has to bat left-handed with a broomstick. You make all these rules in order to enjoy the game. And then as the game is going along, if there's disagreements, you have to argue them out, hammer them out. Think of all the things that children are learning there that are way more important than baseball. They're learning how to be creative, creating the rules, creating the ground rules, adapting to the realities of the situation that you're in, how to make everybody happy, how to negotiate, all of these things that are important to everybody's life. way more important than baseball. Now, very few children, at least in the United States, are playing in this kind of way. If they're playing baseball, they're playing baseball in an adult-directed team, adult-directed league. They're going out to a manicured field. Everything's already prepared for them. They don't have to be creative at all. There's an adult there who's deciding who's going to play what positions, who's on what teams, who gets to start, who's adult there even telling you whether you should bunt or hit the ball hard. You don't have to make any decisions for yourself because there's an adult there doing it for you. You are, and the goal is very different. When you're playing, nobody really cares who wins or loses in the end. You may cheer wildly when your team makes a score, but when this is in the self-directed game, but when you are in the adult-directed game, it's pretty clear that you're supposed to try to win. There's a trophy on the line. Pretty good chance that your parents, or at least one of your parents, is there sitting watching you. There's all kinds of anxiety about high performance and so on and so forth. It's an entirely different experience. It may be a good way to learn baseball. It may be a good way to learn how to bunt or to learn how to slide into second base. But how many people are going to go on in life to be professional baseball players? Not very many. So the skills learned are very narrow and useful for a certain number of people. I'm not against those formal games. In fact, at some point I began to play formal baseball in high school. But it should not be the way little kids play baseball, and it should not be the way people learn baseball. It should not be the bread and butter of baseball. The bread and butter of children's lives should be play, and baseball should be play, not a formal adult-directed activity. Okay, let me go on to the second characteristic of play, which is that play is intrinsically motivated. What this means is that you're doing it for its own sake. You're doing it just because you want to do it. You're not doing it to get a gold star or an A on a report card or to win some trophy or to get your parents' praise or a teacher's praise or to add to your resume. You're just doing it because you want to do it. That's what makes so many adults, unfortunately, think play is a waste of time. You're just doing it because you want to do it. You're not getting anything for it. You're not improving your resume for it. You're not earning any money for it. You're not getting any rewards for it. Why would you do it? It seems like a waste of time from the mentality of, unfortunately, of so many adults. You're doing it because you want to do it. It makes you happy to do it. And you know how commencement speakers at schools often talk about following your passions. Follow your passions. How do children find their passions? They find their passions in play. They find their passions by doing whatever it is they want to do. They're choosing. This is intrinsically motivated. I really enjoy doing this. That's what a passion is. I enjoy doing this. And those who are lucky have lots of time to pursue their passions in play and develop skills on it. And my research indicates that children who have a lot of that kind of opportunity very frequently go on to careers which are extensions of their passion and interests. So just to take one example, a woman who became a captain of a cruise ship played endlessly with boats as a child and developed a passion for boats and boating and eventually apprenticed herself to a ship captain. I could give countless examples like that of developing a passionate interest through play, just doing it because you want to do it, and then figuring out a way to make a living doing it. So play is intrinsically motivated. It's done for its own sake. Play, the third characteristic of play is that play is guided by mental rules. So we talk about, people talk about unstructured play. People use this term. And I don't use the term unstructured play because play is always structured. Play is always structured, and it's always structured by the players themselves. or at least the players are themselves accepting the structure. If they're choosing to play a game that has a preordained structure to it, a formal game that has rules and they have some sense, although they often feel free to modify those rules. So play is always a structured activity. Play is not random. Play is freely chosen, but it's not free-form activity. Once you've decided to play, you are bounding yourself to a certain range of activity that defines this way of playing. So, for example, in constructive play, you're building a sandcastle. I'm building a sandcastle. You're not just randomly piling up sand. You're building a sandcastle. You've got in mind, there's rules here. You've got in mind what a sandcastle looks like. You've got in mind a sense of the sandcastle you want to build. And you're behaving within that bounds of what your mental concept of the sandcastle is. If you're playing, what might look like the wildest kind of play, rough and tumble play, imagine a couple of boys who are swinging sticks at one another, or they're pushing one another around, or they're wrestling on the ground. It looks absolutely wild. It looks from the outside like there's no rules here. These kids are just behaving in a kind of random and wild and almost semi-violent way. But if you look more closely, and if you've had experience playing this way, you know that this play is bound by rules. No kicking, no biting. If no actual hitting with the stick, you swing the sticks, but you don't hit the person with the stick. No, if you're the bigger or the stronger of the two, you have to self-handicap in some way. If you're throwing the person down, you throw them on something soft. All of these rules make it play as opposed to a real fight. The difference between play and a real fight is play has rules. The real fight doesn't. The real fight, anything goes. You're just trying to drive the other person away or subdue them. Play has rules, and the reason it has rules in this case is because you have to have these rules to keep one another happy. If you actually hurt the other person, the play is over. You don't want the play to end. A fight, the goal is to end it, to get the other person out of there. But in play, the goal is to keep it going, to make sure that everybody's having fun. So even this wild-looking kind of play has rules. It's an exercise in restraint. Those boys are learning to be close to one another, to be acting in a mock aggressive way, but to restrain themselves in some ways that they are not actually hurting one another. All play is an exercise in restraint. All play involves following rules, remaining within, inhibiting your impulses. I think one of the reasons that we have such high levels of ADHD, at least in the United States, is because children are not learning how to inhibit their impulses, because they're not being allowed to play sufficiently in order to learn those skills. Some people need more opportunities to learn how to inhibit their impulses than other people do. I think the other reason ADHD is so common is because we're often calling normal child behavior, especially normal boy behavior, as disordered. But if there is any reality to the idea that impulsiveness has increased in the society of children, I think it's because of the lack of play, which is where, and especially the lack of vigorous play of the kind that I just described, which is where children learn to inhibit their impulses. So play is nature's way of teaching children how to control their impulses and behave in accordance with shared conceptions of how to behave. So the fourth characteristic of play that I've listed here is that play is imaginative and creative. Play has rules, but there's always room for creativity within the rules. The rules are not rigid. The rules present the boundaries within which you can be infinitely creative. And all play is creative. Play is the most creative thing that anybody ever does. It's by nature creative. You can't play without being creative. So play is how children learn to be creative. They are creating their play. They're creating the rules. They're creating solutions to the problems that arise in play. Play is how children learn to be creative. And as part of it being creative, it's imaginative, as I've described before. Play is how children learn hypothetical thinking because they're putting themselves in an imaginary world and they're saying, within this imaginary world, these things are true, and what are the consequences of that? If these things are true, what else has to be true? So play is how children learn to be creative. It is how children learn how they train their imagination. Imagination is crucial to all of the kinds of accomplishments that we admire in human beings, at least all of the accomplishments that aren't just purely physical strength kinds of accomplishments. So think of what an architect does in building, in designing a house. The architect has to first imagine the house. Imagine, it's an act of imagination. Imagine what this house might look like. Imagine how the flow of people through this house. Imagine how it would relate to the environment around it. It's all an imaginary process. This house doesn't exist yet, but it's it exists only in the mind of the architect. Then maybe it exists on paper, and then maybe it's a model house. It's like a playhouse. I'm building this model that I've imagined. This is just like constructive play. All of this has to happen before it becomes a real house. So think of scientists. Scientists don't just collect data. They develop hypotheses to explain the data. That's imagination. Nobody ever saw gravity. We just imagined it. We just imagined it, and we imagined it and accept it because it explains a lot of things. This is hypothetical reasoning. You know, Einstein imagined the solution to how to the relationship between matter and energy, and he developed the theory of relativity in a very clearly, almost childlike, imaginative way, combined, of course, with all he knew about physics and his ability with mathematics. But he says that the idea of relativity germinated through his imagining what it would be like to chase a sunbeam and catch up to it. So, you know, what a childlike scene, what a childlike form of imagination. It can be said that those people that we call geniuses are very often those people who've retained the childlike capacity for imagination and combined it with all that they have learned and developed over the course of their life related to the field of their endeavors. So the fifth characteristic of play is that it is conducted in an active, alert, but non-stressed, or at least relatively non-stressed frame of mind. Sometimes I omit this characteristic. I say there's just four, because this characteristic really simply falls logically from the other characteristics. It's in some sense not a new characteristic. Because play requires attention to one's own behavior, to the rules, requires that you be actively doing the thing. Play requires an active and alert mind. But because play is an activity that has no real world consequences, because no adults are judging you while you're doing it, because no trophy is on the line, it doesn't matter. If you fail, you've learned something, but you haven't lost anything. Because you can quit at any time if it becomes too stressful. For all of those reasons, play is not stressful. So play, because it's not stressful, play is a simulation world. It's a place where you can safely practice things for the real world. You can try out behaviors that you would be afraid to try out in the real world because you might be judged negatively for it, or you're going to fail and people will say that you failed. So play is the ideal space for learning new things, for being creative, for trying different ways of being, for essentially all of what we call learning. Play is the ideal condition for doing that. And yet we form our schools, which are the opposite of this, where you're constantly being judged, constantly being evaluated, where you're never safe from evaluation. You will fail. You will be called a failure if you try something and don't succeed at it. Better to clam up in that condition, or better to just rely on what you already know and try to get by with that rather than to actually try some new creative way of thinking to solve the problem. So that's I also might add that this state of mind, this alert and active but non-stressed, is what some researchers refer to as flow. Flow, there's a lot of research showing that people in a state of flow are often more creative, they're more productive, this is a state where you're attending to the activity itself. You're not thinking about yourself and how you might look to other people. You're not thinking so much about the time that's involved. You're really immersed in the task that you are involved in. There's also research showing that this mental state, this playful mental state, is the ideal state for learning anything new and for solving problems that require some kind of creative or insightful leap. Let me just give you an example of one such study that demonstrates that. So some years ago, Alice Eisen, a researcher at Cornell University in the United States, performed a study in which she gave college students an insight problem to solve. And she did it under two different conditions. One condition was the normal condition, actually three conditions. One condition was the normal condition. She just brings them into the laboratory to solve the problem. Another condition is a playful condition where she puts them in a kind of playful mood by having them watch a slapstick comedy, a little short of a slapstick comedy that puts them in a kind of playful mood, helps them realize, okay, we're just here to play. This is all fun and games here. And another case, just to make sure it isn't just watching the film that is the key thing, they watch a travel log or some other kind of film that does not necessarily produce a playful state of mind. The problem that she used in one of her studies is called the candle problem. It's a classic insight problem where you're given a small candle, a book of matches, a box of tacks, and there's a bulletin board in the room, and your job is to mount the candle on the bulletin board in such a way that it's upright and you can light it. The solution to the problem, which seems very obvious once it's said, is to dump the tacks out of the tack box, tack the box to the bulletin board and mount the candle on top of it and then light the candle with one of the matches. Seems obvious once it's said, but the fact of the matter is when this study is actually done with college students and they're given a certain amount of time to solve it, only about 15% solve it. And in this experiment, she found that in the two control conditions, where either they watched the travelogue or watched no film, about 15% solved the problem. After watching a slapstick comedy, 75% slap the problem. A huge effect, a huge effect, a huge difference. Subsequently, she did studies with professionals, for example, doctors. She would give them a difficult diagnostic problem to solve, and where there was a clear solution, but it wasn't obvious how to reach it. And the doctors reached it better if she put them in a playful mood first, just by giving them a little candy, acting in a kind of playful way, and so on. And they were much better at solving this problem. So it's not just college students, it's professionals as well. I think we all solve problems better, especially problems that involve some kind of leap of insight if we're in a playful mood. And it's not just a small effect, it's a huge effect. So so I now want to go on here to Roman numeral 3, play deficit disorder, a plague of modern times. This is something that I have written about. I talk about it in my book, Free to Learn. I've written academic articles pertaining to it. This is not my own research, but this is summaries of based on research that other people have done over the decades. We are, at least in the United States and in many other countries, suffering from what I've been calling play deficit disorder. Over the course of decades, this isn't just recent. This has been occurring for a long time. Ever since the middle point, or just beyond the middle point of the 20th century, we have been gradually taking the opportunity for play away from children. Howard Chudikoff, who wrote a book on the history of play in America, talks about the first half of the 20th century as the golden age of children's play, because we had pretty much done away with child labor, but we hadn't increased schooling so much that children now had lots of time to play. They were more like children in traditional cultures who also have lots of time to play. But ever since, according to Chudikoff, about 1960, we've been gradually taking that time away from children. And I have to say, this has been the period of my own life, and so I've seen it in my own life. It's no surprise to me that historians are talking about this and social scientists are talking about this. We've taken it away gradually by giving children other things that they have to do that are adult directed, that are not unsupervised activity. We've also not only just taken play away, but we've taken a lot of other kinds of independent activities away. It used to be that children could get part-time jobs, paper routes by the time they were 10 or 11 years old, babysitting, mowing other people's lawns. I worked as a messenger boy for a publishing company beginning when I was 13 years old as an after-school job. These kinds of jobs are no longer available. In fact, many of them are now illegal in the United States because it's regarded as unsafe for children of these age to be doing these things, and it's also regarded as not good for their development. They're supposed to be doing school all the time. So we've taken not just play, but other kinds of independent, self-controlled activities away from children gradually over the decades. The increased weight of schooling has been especially dramatic. When I was a child in elementary school in the 1950s, we had 5 less weeks of school in the school year than children do today. We had a full extra month of vacation in the summer and another week off of school during the year. The school day ended when school day ended. We didn't have homework. In elementary school, we simply did not have homework. Once in a while, a teacher might ask us to write a story or a poem and bring it back the next day, something creative like that. But we did not lug books back and forth between school and home or bring home worksheets or those kinds of things. We did school in school. The school day, at least at the school I went to, was in elementary school, was 6 hours long, and many schools still have that, at least as their official school day, although some of them now have 7 hours. But 2 of those hours were outdoors playing. So we were really only indoors in school, as school, for 4 hours a day. We had a half-hour recess for the middle of the morning, full hour at lunch, a half-hour recess in the middle of the afternoon. And those were times of free play. As far as I remember, teachers weren't even watching us during those times. We played in whatever ways we wanted to play. Rough and tumble, snowball fights, building forts, this was in northern Minnesota, building snow forts, playing with knives. All the boys carried pocket knives in those days. We never threw them at one another, but we played all kinds of games with knives and so on and so forth. Nothing like that can happen in school anymore. So we had basically 2 hours of play in school, aside from the play that occurs after school and on weekends. Now children not only have, in many cases, for example, the elementary schools in Boston today, 15 minutes of recess a day. Lunch hour is nothing close to an hour of law. And in some schools, children are not even allowed to talk during lunch hour, or they have to keep it low. School has become a kind of environment that you or I or no other adult that I know would ever accept for their own work environment. It has become a repressive environment where you are not allowed freedom. You are more or less directed by adults all of the time. So that's one thing that has happened, and homework has happened, so that even elementary school children, let alone secondary school children, are continuing to do schoolwork at home. Then in addition to that, we've provided children with all kinds of school-like activities, even beyond school. So as I talked about before, instead of just going out to play baseball or whatever you want to play in your own way, you're going out to play in an adult-directed sport or an adult-directed other activity. You're taking karate classes or Chinese calligraphy or whatever the heck it is that your parents are driving you to. You're not even having the opportunity to get there yourself, which is a playful kind of activity, an opportunity to develop self-confidence and freedom. So this has all happened, and it's happened gradually over time, so that we've hardly noticed it. It happens gradually. It's not like if we suddenly went from what was like in the 1950s to what it is today, everybody would rebel. This is crazy. This is not normal childhood. We can't do this. You just can't keep children in school that long without letting them go out and play. Everybody would say that. But because it's been gradual, because with every generation, the change is only a small amount, we accept it. And the result is we now have an environment which is truly an abusive environment for children, is now the normal environment in which children are growing up in. And then we wonder why it is that children are suffering from anxiety and depression at higher rates than they ever have in the past. Why the rates of suicide among children of school age are now at least 6 times what they were in the 1960s. This is in the United States, according to data from the Center for Disease Control's a quite reliable source of data. The data on anxiety and depression comes from normative clinical questionnaires that have been given over the years to school-age children, unchanged. And what they show is that by the end of the 20th century, the rates of anxiety and depression as measured by that, if you look at what would be the cutoff for diagnosis today, or likely diagnosis today of a major depressive disorder, clinically significant anxiety disorder, what the data show is that the rates of these disorders among secondary school children and among college students is now somewhere between 5 and 8 times what it was in the 1950s and 1960s, and that's data that the last data point was early in the 21st century, we now have close to 20 more years of increasing anxiety and depression. So this is the situation that we have. To me, it doesn't take much imagination. It doesn't take much thinking to realize that there would be a cause and effect relationship between the decline of play, the decline of children's freedom, and the rise of these mental disorders. Take away play from children's life and you're going to get depression. How could you not? One famous play theorist some years ago used to say that the opposite of play is not work, it's depression. It's pretty obvious. Play is what makes you happy. Take away what makes you happy and life is pretty depressing. If instead of play, you put children more and more into adult-judged activities where they're constantly being surveilled and compared to their peers and tested and told that they're failures if they don't pass this test, how are you not going to get anxiety from that, right? Wouldn't that produce anxiety in any of us? It doesn't really require too much thinking to think that you've changed children's lives in these ways and you're going to increase depression and anxiety. And yet almost nobody admits that. Nobody admits it. Nobody wants to say, it's because of school. It's because of the way we're restraining lives. They come up with anything else they can come up with. Oh, it's because of social media. It's because of me. It's because of the iPhone. It's because we want to find some excuse for it beyond the obvious. We fail to admit the obvious. There was a study a few years ago in the United States by the American Psychological Association called Stress in America. What they found through this study was that school-age teenagers are the most stressed out people in America. And 83% of them, when they were asked about the source of stress, said it's school. The popular press ignored that completely. A tiny little effect of social media, that's all over the popular press, right? That's all over the popular press. But a huge effect where the kids themselves are saying, it's not social media, it's school that's driving me crazy. That is totally ignored by the popular press. What the press said, and the other thing that happens all the time is instead of recognizing, wait, this is a problem we need to solve by changing what we're doing to kids, what happens is the way we solve this problem is more therapy. We're going to hire more school therapists. We're going to have counseling. We're going to have anti-suicide programs. We're going to have suicide hotlines. We're going to treat it as basically as if this is a problem that resides within the individual and we need to treat it as the individual's problem rather than recognize this is a social problem. This is a problem of how we are treating children in our world today. Okay, so not only has mental health declined, but also creativity has declined. There's actually, believe it or not, a standardized set of tests for creativity. Torrance's test of creative thinking is a valid test in the sense that it's been used for decades among school-age children. And what is found is that those children who score high on this are far more likely, other things being equal, as adults to be creatively productive in adulthood. It's a better predictor of creative achievement in adulthood than any other test we have. Better than IQ tests, way better than grades in school, which are really not a predictor at all. Better than teachers' judgments of who is going to be highly creative. And the sad fact is that at least ever since the mid-1980s, scores on this test have been going down among school-age children at every grade level. Down so much that by the last data points that I'm aware of, which were about 2010, the average score for school-age children in the United States on this test of creativity was at what would have been the 15th percentile in 1984. A huge decline in creative thinking. Again, no surprise. You take away play, which is how children learn to be creative. You take away the creative activities that are used to occur in school. And you substitute drill for tests, which is the least creative thing you can possibly be doing. How is creativity not going to go down when you make those kinds of changes? Again, this is all a no-brainer. We're not thinking when we do these things. We're not thinking when we look for other reasons to explain the decline in creativity, the decline in children's mental well-being, and so on. So now I'm going to bring it to an end very quickly because I want to allow at least some time for questions and discussion. But I have this at Roman numeral 4 here, how play promotes well-being and peace. And I want to, it should be kind of obvious from what I've just been describing, but I want to, as a kind of summary, say a few words about what are the psychological ingredients for mental well-being, for a sense of happiness and satisfaction with life. There's a whole realm of psychological theory and research that is referred to as self-determination theory. It was developed initially about 3 decades ago by Richard Ryan and Edward Dacey, who are professors at Rochester University of the United States. And they, through a great deal of research, have found, no surprise, that mental well-being depends upon certain felt abilities within the individual. And basically what they found is that people who are mentally very healthy and who are doing well in life, who are enjoying life, who are succeeding in life, have these characteristics. One is a strong sense of autonomy. I'm in control of my own life. I can decide what I want to do. Secondly, a sense of competence. Not only can I decide what I want to do, but I can do it well. I may not already be able to do it well, but I can figure out how to do it well. I have a sense of competence. I have a sense that I am able to do things. And third, I have friends. I have colleagues. I have people that I can rely on. I have intimate friends who boost me and keep me in good spirits, keep me emotionally well. And I have a second level of friends who are kind of colleagues who can help me when I call upon them when I need help. These are the 3 characteristics of mental well-being: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. I think all you need to do is look back on that handout and see how all of these relate to play. Play is autonomy. Play is the expression of freedom. Play is the practice of freedom. Competence. Play is how children practice all those skills that I listed early on, all those skills that are so important to human activity. And relatedness. Play is how you learn to get along with other people. It's how you learn to make friends. It's how you learn to keep friends. It's how you learn to pay attention to other people's needs. And I might say, since I've included morality as part of the goal of education, it is how you learn to realize that the world that you want to be successful in, you will only be successful in if other people are also successful. You can only be happy if the other people around you are also happy. And so you learn that it's not all about me. It's also about the other people in the world. When you're playing socially, it can't be all about me. Nobody's going to play with you if you do that. And that's such an important lesson to learn. And you're learning to compromise, you're learning to accept, and you are also learning that a good life depends on doing the things you want to do You need a certain amount of money, you need a certain amount of material goods to survive, but beyond that, that's not what makes you happy. What makes you happy is not achieved through greed, it's not achieved through taking things away from other people. It's achieved through pursuing the interests that you have and through helping other people and having a sense of accomplishment. I might also just say one final point. This would be a lecture in itself, but play is incompatible with dominance behavior. Play requires that you set aside dominance, because if you act in a domineering way, nobody's going to play with you. Play is the antidote to dominance. There's research that shows that the most playful societies are also the most egalitarian societies. The most playful and egalitarian societies are hunter-gatherer societies, but it's also true for other cultures as well. To the degree that you see play, you see egalitarianism. To the degree that you see suppression of play, you see hierarchy and dominance in the structure of the society. So I'm going to bring it to a close there. I hope I've convinced you that if we want a happy and peaceful world, we have to allow children to play much more than we are today in most countries in the world. So I'm going to close now, and I guess we have 10 minutes or so for questions and discussion.
Yes, I didn't see any questions, just great comments. People are really appreciating everything that you've said and shared, and me included. I have a little question for you. Not a question, but it made me think. I got into education at a time where Maria Montessori was a mentor that I found, and I found her extraordinary. And there's a big thing between Steiner and Montessori that say we should let the children play and not do any work. But my experience with Maria Montessori is that she said children, all they want is let me do it by myself. And she spoke the same language you speak to me. And the environment she created was to let children go and be free and explore in their own. She just put a lot of things, richness around them, so they would have things. What do you think about that?
Yeah, what you've described, I clearly agree with. And I, unlike you, don't know Montessori directly. I've read some of her works, and I have visited a few Montessori schools. And what I can say is that, as you probably know, Montessori schools vary a lot from one to another, and there are different kinds of interpretations of Montessori.
Completely.
The interpretation that I don't agree with, and I don't know if it is fair to Maria Montessori, is that she discouraged fantasy play. She was all in favor of constructive play, and that the toys were all aimed at promoting constructive play. And that part of the reason, according to some people at least, that she took this approach was because she was at least initially working with children who had some sort of problems. And it was important to her to get them thinking in reality terms rather than fantasy terms. And so she tended to focus. So there's still a tendency among Montessorians to say, we need to kind of control what the children are playing at. So we want them to play with these blocks because they'll learn certain mental concepts playing with them. And, that doesn't exactly resonate with me to the degree that people are interpreting it that way. I think children are the best determinants of what they of what they need to play with, and that the real skills of playing have to do with self-choice and figuring things out. And as I made clear in my talk, I think fantasy play is extraordinarily important. It's how you develop the capacity, among other things, for hypothetical reasoning.
Yes,
so,
I completely agree with you. Actually, that's why I created the IWE model, which is a mixture between Steiner and Montessori and other great things I discovered along the way. But I think the fantasy part is very important. I think the way she explained it, or how I learned it, was that she said, for example, a child that is constructing himself, so up until the age of the absorbing mind, until 6 years old, she said that child is creating a reality for himself. And if we put too much fantasy, like, a child can fly, or a child can, maybe a child will jump out of a building to fly because he thinks he can do it. And so there was a little bit of caution around that. And I think maybe you're right, is because she came from the psychiatric hospital background and working with mental illness. So she might have wanted to protect that a little. But yeah.
We still today hear of, there's still this fear that people have that children can't distinguish between fantasy and reality, which is completely false. As soon as, it may be true for some children who have a real brain problem, brain damage of some sort or another, or developmental difficulty, but by the time children can talk, they can distinguish between what's real and what's not real, between fiction and reality. A 2-year-old who's pouring water, imaginary water from a cup, or even an imaginary cup, over a doll, says, "Oh, the dolly's all wet." Well, that child knows the dolly isn't really all wet. We see this all the time. There's no question but what children can distinguish between fantasy and reality. They don't think that because they're pretending that they can fly, that they can really fly. They're not going to jump out of windows or all of those kinds of things.
What about monsters or witches, or all the things that, because as much as I love Steiner as well, that concerns me a little bit, the fairy tales that are taught a little bit, for me, too young. What?
Well, I think that, so here's what I think. I think that you never want to force those on a child, right? This is why I don't think they should be taught, right? That if the child wants to hear these stories, the child wants to hear the stories, and that means the child is ready for these stories. So it's an interesting question. Why do children play? I already said why children play at frightening things like climbing trees, but why do they play at frightening things like witches and murder and death and evil things? I think children are drawn to those for the same reason that they're drawn to playing in physically risky ways. They are learning how to cope with fears. They're learning how they're playing with, when they are involved in these stories, when they're playing this kind of ways, they're playing with fears. And they're learning how to cope with those fears and deal with them. There was a study published a number of years ago. It was in Germany, where this researcher was observing in various what would then have been called nursery schools, and noticing that some of the children were sometimes playing in ways that an adult would be tempted to stop. So one of the games that they were playing was a game in which they would tie up one of the kids, a boy, and begin to whip him, imaginarily whip him. So everybody was involved in whipping this boy who's tied up. Now, of course, they weren't whipping him really hard. And so they would alternate between whipping him and then comforting him. And this was a game they played, and the teacher would stop it whenever she saw it. But when she didn't stop it, this observer saw that the children were, the observer's interpretation was that the children were dealing with something that they would be afraid of, and they were also dealing with how to resolve the problem that they are afraid of. They would alternate. That this was a really important lesson. Her view was that the only real violence that was occurring in that nursery school was when the teacher stopped them from playing in this way, that was violence. To stop children from playing when they're having fun, when they themselves are all agreeing to play this way, that's violence.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I could talk with you for so much longer, and I would like to, if you are open to leaving your email or something to, but we have to give to the next speaker now. But yes, I would be honored to speak with you some more.
Sure.